In 1985, deep within the misty Sierra Mazateca mountains of Oaxaca, a frail old woman lay dying on a dirt floor, starving and despised by the very village she had spent a lifetime healing. Her name was Maria Sabina, the priestess of the fungi, and while she breathed her last in abject poverty, the Western world was busy building a multi-million-dollar counterculture empire upon the sacred secret she had unwittingly revealed. This is not merely a story about a drug, nor is it a celebration of the psychedelic revolution that defined the 60s. It is a tragedy of cosmic proportions, a dark chronicle of how a banker from New York stole the flesh of the gods and turned a holy sacrament into a recreational toy. Tonight, we open the files on the greatest spiritual theft in history to ask, was the magic mushroom a gift to humanity, or was it Maria Sabina's eternal curse? Chapter 1. Flesh of the Gods, Teonnanacatl. To grasp the full weight of the tragedy that would befall Maria Sabina, we must first descend into the shadows of history, back to a time when the mushroom was not a symbol of counterculture rebellion, but a terrifying conduit to the absolute. Centuries before the first hippie set foot in Mexico, the Aztecs revered the fungi as Teonnanacatl, a Nahuatl term translating literally to flesh of the gods. This was no recreational indulgence for the bored or the curious. It was a holy sacrament, as solemn and heavy as the stone altars upon which they offered human hearts. Chronicles from the time revealed that at the coronation of Montezuma II in 1502, the Aztec elite consumed the bitter fungi not to escape reality, but to confront it in its most raw and terrifying form. Friar Bernardino de Sahagún, one of the earliest Spanish chroniclers, wrote with trembling hand of these gatherings, describing how men would weep in terror, seeing visions of their own deaths, or laugh maniacally as the gods whispered the secrets of the future. In this ancient world, the mushroom was an oracle, a direct line to the divine that demanded total, trembling submission. However, the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors brought with it the cross and the sword, igniting a spiritual genocide against the indigenous sacraments. To the rigid dogmas of the Catholic Church, there was only one communion allowed, the body of Christ through the Holy Eucharist. The sight of indigenous priests communing with invisible entities through Teonnanacatl was viewed not as a valid religious experience, but as direct communication with Satan. The Holy Inquisition launched a brutal campaign to eradicate the practice, hunting down the mushroom eaters with the same fanatical zeal used to burn witches in Europe. Altars were smashed, lineages were broken, and the flesh of the gods was branded a tool of the devil. The gate to the spirit world, it seemed, had been slammed shut by the iron hand of the Church. But you cannot kill a god simply by forbidding it. You only force it to hide. To survive the spiritual purge, the keepers of the sacred knowledge fled the conquered cities and retreated deep into the mist-shrouded, inaccessible peaks of the Sierra Mazateca. Here, in the isolation of the cloud forests, the tradition did not die. It evolved. The Mazatec curanderos performed a master stroke of spiritual camouflage, hiding their ancient animist gods behind the faces of Catholic saints. The mushroom rituals moved into the shadows of the night, performed behind barred doors in hushed whispers. This was the birth of the velada, a syncretic night vigil where the little holy children, as the mushrooms came to be known, shared the altar with crucifixes and images of the Virgin Mary. For 400 years, while the rest of the world forgot, the mushroom thrived in this hermetic silence. For the Mazatec, This was strictly medicine. One did not summon the holy children to see pretty colors or to find oneself. One summoned them to cure a fever that defied herbal remedies, to locate a lost object, or to identify which neighbor had cursed a family's crops. The velada was a practical, often terrifying medical procedure used to maintain order in a chaotic world. It was a burden carried by the wise, a serious duty protected by the dark, a secret ecosystem waiting, completely unsuspecting, for the modern world to knock on the door and shatter the silence forever. Chapter 2. The Banker and the Curandera, 1950s. The collision of two worlds often produces a shockwave. But rarely in history has there been a cultural impact as seismic as the one that occurred in the mid-1950s. On one side stood the ancient mystical world of the Sierra Mazateca, preserved in the amber of isolation for centuries. On the other stood R. Gordon Wasson, a man who represented the absolute pinnacle of modern Western capitalism. Wasson was no counterculture radical, no bohemian poet, and certainly no spiritual drifter. He was a vice president at J.P. Morgan, a buttoned-up Wall Street banker with a respectable suit and a methodical, rational mind. Yet beneath the veneer of high finance lay a burning obsession. For years, Wasson and his wife Valentina had been tracking a ghost, a persistent whisper in the anthropological archives suggesting that an ancient pre-Hispanic mushroom cult had survived the Inquisition and still existed somewhere in the remote mountains of Mexico. To his colleagues, he was analyzing market trends. In his soul, he was hunting for the holy grail of botany. In 1953, Wasson made his first trek into the muddy, rain-soaked trails of Huautla de Jimenez, a village suspended in the clouds where Spanish was barely spoken and electricity was a distant dream. But it wasn't until the summer of 1955 that the stars aligned. Wasson arrived in Huautla not as a conqueror, but as a humble supplicant. Through the intervention of a local town official, he was introduced to Maria Sabina. She was a woman of humble stature, weather-beaten by the mountain sun, living in a simple dirt floor hut. She did not know, and could not have known, that this polite white stranger would be the architect of her ruin. In the Mazatec tradition, the curandera serves those who ask. Healing is not withheld from the needy. Perhaps she saw a spiritual sickness in him, or perhaps she simply followed the duty of her calling. Whatever the reason, on the night of June 29, 1955, Maria Sabina made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of human consciousness. She invited Wasson to partake in a velada. That night, in the flickering shadows cast by beeswax candles, the barrier between the worlds dissolved. Wasson watched as Maria Sabina ritually cleansed the mushrooms in the smoke of copal, chanting in a rhythmic, hypnotic dialect that sounded like water flowing over ancient stones. She handed him the little holy children. Wasson chewed the acrid, bitter fungi and waited in the darkness. What followed shattered his reality. He later described seeing geometric patterns colored with the richest hues, which transformed into architectural structures and landscapes of impossible beauty. He saw palaces, mythical beasts, and vistas that no human eye had ever seen. For the first time in recorded history, a white Westerner had been fully initiated into the sacred mystery. He knelt in the mud, overcome with awe, realizing that the legends were true. The mushroom was not a myth. It was a key, and he was holding it. If the story had stayed in that hut, Maria Sabina might have lived out her days in peace. But Wasson was a man of the media age. He returned to New York, his mind expanding with a story too big to keep. On May 13, 1957, Life magazine, the most influential publication in America at the time, dropped a cultural bombshell. The cover story, titled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom," featured glossy, high-resolution photographs of the Velada taken by Wasson's companion. It was a sensation. Millions of Americans, bored with the gray conformity of the Eisenhower era, stared at the images of the curandera invoking spirits in the dark. Wasson tried to protect her anonymity. In the article, he gave her the pseudonym Eva Mendez. But he made a fatal error. He did not hide the name of the village, Huautla de Jimenez. He had given the world a treasure map, and he had marked the X right over Maria Sabina's home. The article was not just a report. It was a siren song. The secret that had survived the Spanish Inquisition, the Catholic Church, and centuries of silence had been sold on newsstands for 20 cents. The box was open, and the demons of the modern world were about to pour in. Chapter 3: The Hippie Invasion. The Desecration. The publication of the Life magazine article didn't just open a door, it blew the walls off the sanctuary. As the 1960s dawned, bringing with them a tidal wave of counterculture revolution, the quiet, mist-laden village of Huautla de Jimenez was transformed into the epicenter of a spiritual gold rush. They came in droves, thousands of young Americans and Europeans carrying backpacks, guitars, and a desperate hunger for enlightenment. They were the long-haired ones, the hippies, seeking a shortcut to God that R. Gordon Wasson had promised them was waiting in a mud hut in Mexico. The pilgrimage became a rite of passage for the psychedelic elite. Rumors swirled through the village, and later through history books, that rock gods like Bob Dylan, John Lennon, and Mick Jagger had trekked up the mountain roads to sit at the feet of the humble priestess. Huautla was no longer a hidden village. It had become the Woodstock of the occult. But this was not a respectful cultural exchange. It was an invasion. The clash between the Mazatec tradition and the Western appetite for experience was violent in its dissonance. For the Mazatec, the Velada was a somber, terrifying engagement with the infinite, performed only at night, in total darkness, and always for the purpose of healing a specific ailment. It was a surgery of the soul. The hippies, however, had no interest in curing a fever or finding a lost goat. They wanted to trip. They wanted to see the colors Wasson had described. They treated the flesh of the gods not as a sacrament, but as a ticket to a cosmic amusement park. The desecration was visceral. Visitors began to consume the mushrooms in broad daylight, a grave taboo in Mazatec culture, where the fungi were creatures of the night, easily offended by the sun. They wandered the village streets in dazed stupors, laughing at invisible jokes, stripping off their clothes, and disrespecting the solemnity of the local customs. They camped in the pastures, trampling crops, and demanding the magic from anyone who would sell it. Maria Sabina, once the respected guardian of the gateway, was reduced to a tourist attraction. Her hut was besieged day and night. People didn't come to her for her wisdom or her songs. They came to buy the chemical. She later lamented that many of them didn't even wait for the ritual. They simply bought the mushrooms and ate them like snacks, bypassing the priestess entirely. The tragedy deepened as the sacred became commodified. The sudden demand created a black market. Local children, seeing the foreigners waving dollars, began foraging for the mushrooms to sell to the tourists, stripping the hillsides bare. The little holy children were being trafficked. This chaos inevitably drew the attention of the Mexican federal authorities. Police raids became common. The federales swept through the village, arresting the long-haired foreigners and harassing the locals who harbored them. The quiet reverence of the Sierra Mazateca was replaced by the sirens of police jeeps and the paranoia of a drug war. The village elders looked on in horror. To them, it wasn't just a public nuisance. It was a spiritual catastrophe. They believed that the sacred force of the mushroom was being diluted, leaked away by the casual, profane use of the outsiders. The magic was not infinite, and the world was drinking it dry. Chapter 4. The Curse of Maria Sabina. As the chaos of the counterculture swirled around Huatla, the atmosphere within the village curdled into something poisonous. The Mazatec community, tight-knit and fiercely protective of their traditions, did not direct their anger at the ignorant foreigners who trampled their fields. They turned their furious gaze upon the woman who had opened the gate. Maria Sabina became a pariah in her own land. To her neighbors, she was no longer the revered Sabia, the wise one who healed the sick and comforted the dying. She was branded a traitor, a woman who had sold the ancient secrets of the ancestors for the attention of the white man. Whispers spread through the market that she had grown rich off the little holy children, a cruel and bitter irony given that she remained destitute, often struggling to find enough food to eat. Jealousy and resentment festered like an infection in the damp mountain air, and soon the violence turned physical. One terrifying night, the simmering hatred boiled over. A group of villagers, emboldened by the chaos and the breakdown of social order that had engulfed their town, marched to Maria Sabina's humble home. They set it ablaze. Maria, old and frail, watched in horror as the flames consumed the only shelter she had, burning her few possessions and the altars where she had prayed for decades. She barely escaped with her life, forced to flee into the darkness she once commanded, shivering in the cold while her history turned to ash. But the fire was only the beginning of her punishment. The Mexican police, pressured by the government to clean up the drug problem caused by the influx of international tourists, targeted her not as a holy woman, but as a drug dealer. The woman who had served as a spiritual conduit for her people was dragged into police cars, interrogated, and treated like a common criminal. The humiliation was absolute. Yet the physical violence, the homelessness, and the social ostracization paled in comparison to the spiritual devastation she endured. In the midst of this turmoil, tragedy struck the very heart of her family. Her son was murdered. The exact circumstances remain shrouded in the violent haze of those years. Some say it was a drunken brawl, others say it was retribution against his mother. But for Maria, it was the ultimate price exacted by the disruption of the cosmic balance. She had broken the seal, she had let the outsiders in, and death had entered her house. In her final years, Maria Sabina delivered a lament that stands as one of the most heartbreaking testaments in the history of spirituality. She confessed that the mushrooms had changed. They no longer spoke to her with the clarity and thunder of the old days. She believed that the sheer volume of people using them for frivolous reasons, to find God without suffering, to hallucinate without purpose, had diluted their power. Before Wasson, she famously said, nobody took the children simply to find God. They were always taken to cure the sick. She felt the spirit of the mushroom had been hollowed out, its sanctity evaporated like morning mist under the harsh glare of the western sun. She died believing that she had killed the very thing she loved most. While the West celebrated the age of Aquarius and psychedelic liberation, Maria Sabina was left in the ashes of her life, holding a sacrament that she believed was now empty, silenced by the noise of a world that refused to listen. Chapter 5. The Modern Renaissance. The irony. Fast forward to the present day, and the irony of Maria Sabina's story becomes sharp enough to draw blood. We are currently living through what the media calls the psychedelic renaissance. After decades of the war on drugs, where the little holy children were demonized as agents of madness, the script has flipped entirely. Today, psilocybin is the darling of modern psychiatry. Prestigious institutions like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London are publishing groundbreaking studies showing that the active compound in the mushrooms, the very same compound Maria Sabina served on her altar, is a potent treatment for treatment-resistant depression, severe PTSD, and end-of-life anxiety. The West has finally circled back to the truth that the Mazatec knew for centuries. These fungi are medicine. But in our rush to embrace the cure, we have surgically removed the spirit, sterilizing the sacred into a pill that can be patented, packaged, and sold on the stock market. This modern acceptance is not a vindication of Maria Sabina. It is the final phase of the theft. We are witnessing the industrialization of the divine. Venture capital firms are pouring billions of dollars into a burgeoning psychedelic industry, racing to synthesize and patent specific formulations of psilocybin. We have turned the velada into a clinical appointment. The darkened hut, the copal smoke, and the chanting of the curandera have been replaced by fluorescent-lit clinics, synthetic capsules, and therapists with clipboards. We stripped the mushroom of its cultural context, discarding the ritual container that made it safe, and reduced it to a neurochemical interaction. We accepted the molecule, but rejected the wisdom of the woman who held it. The most bitter pill to swallow is the economic disparity that now exists between the shroom boom investors and the people of Huautla de Jimenez. While CEOs in Silicon Valley microdose to increase productivity and pharmaceutical companies project profits in the billions, Maria Sabina's descendants and the Mazatec community have seen virtually none of this wealth. There is no concept of indigenous reciprocity in the business plans of these biotech giants. The woman who gave this gift to the world died in a dirt floor hut, malnourished and regretful, while the world prepares to feast on the fruits of her betrayal. Huautla today remains a shadow of its former self, a town weary of spiritual tourists, where the authentic traditions struggle to breathe under the weight of commercialization. This is the biopiracy of the soul. We took the flesh of the gods, synthesized it, and sold it back to the public as a lifestyle enhancement. Maria Sabina's fear that the mushrooms had lost their power was prophetic in a way she couldn't have imagined. They haven't lost their chemical potency. Science proves they still trigger the receptors in our brains. But they may have lost their soul. By turning the sacred into a commodity, we have committed the ultimate act of colonization. We have proven that the modern world devours everything it touches, leaving behind only the husk. As we celebrate the healing potential of these substances, we must ask ourselves a haunting question. Can you truly heal the mind of a civilization that is built on the broken back of the woman who tried to save it? In the end, Maria Sabina's life stands as a terrifying mirror to our own insatiable nature. We are a civilization driven to conquer the unknown, to map every corner of the earth and the mind. But in doing so, we often destroy the very mystery that gave it meaning. The little holy children still grow in the damp earth of the Sierra Mazateca, but the silence Maria spoke of remains deafening. Perhaps the mushrooms didn't lose their power. Perhaps they simply stopped speaking to a world that had forgotten how to listen with humility. The tragedy of the priestess is a brutal reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and that the sacred, when dragged into the profane light of the marketplace, casts a long and unforgiving shadow. As we rush headlong into this brave new world of psychedelic medicine, let us tread lightly, for we are walking on the ashes of a sanctuary. We took the cure, but we killed the healer. Thank you for entering the Midnight Vault. If you wish to keep these forgotten histories from fading into the dark, subscribe and join us for the next descent. Until then, sleep well, and may your demons always stay silent.